of inclusion in tech. Notice what Nimoy did not do. He didn't wait for Paramount to create some diversity and inclusion program. He didn't wait for HR to implement some kind of equal salary program. Nimoy acted, and he acted based on his sense of fairness. Nimoy lent Nichols, a fellow artist, the privilege that he had as a male actor and helped her participate in the financial benefits of his gender privilege. Also, while Nichols may not have had Leonard Nimoy around in future roles, I'm sure that she raised her expectations for equal pay when she went to other shows. And that's how leadership works. Leadership improves the environment of the people being led and raises the bar for what they expect from leadership. I think there are a lot of Leonard Nimoys in this audience, and I think that there are other ways to lend privilege to make technology a more diverse and more inclusive industry. But first, we have to understand a few things. We have to understand the difference between diversity and inclusion. Let's say you're throwing a party, and you pop in the invitations to the people you want to come. You might invite some people from high school, you might invite some people from university or college, maybe a few coworkers, and then you're done. You send out the invitations. That's diversity. Inclusion goes further than simply inviting people to your party. Inclusion understands that some people had to travel a lot longer to get to your place, so you're a little bit more appreciative when they show up. Inclusion understands that some people have certain dietary restrictions, so you make sure that you may have vegan options or gluten-free options. Or maybe you know that some people don't drink alcohol, so you make sure that there are non-alcoholic options at your party. Inclusion requires empathy, and all that empathy is understanding that people are different, and you embrace those differences and what they bring to your environment. Now, I know that inclusion and diversity often become buzzwords, and a lot of people throw them around, but I really want to focus on this difference because diversity is very easy to gain. And you see a lot of companies, they release their numbers, and they really don't have a lot of meaning. But inclusion takes real effort. And as Nimoy realized, inclusion will not come from corporate policy. Corporations, and I learned this in business school, corporations are primarily designed to return value to their shareholders. And while there are many studies that show that diversity and inclusion have business value, that innovative companies are usually inclusive companies, corporations aren't designed with inclusion in mind. And most companies put inclusion work in the HR department. And there was a recent article about a woman who worked for a very famous company that chronicled her saga in fighting the HR department at her company, which didn't offer her any help when she experienced bias at that company. And so we have to understand that the HR department is not designed to protect you. HR is designed to protect the company. So we can't trust tech companies to embrace the social and financial and cultural benefits of inclusion, and these benefits often go to their employees and shareholders. But I think that what we need is a grassroots movement. We need people everywhere in tech to take the baton from Leonard Nimoy and all take a role in making our industry more diverse and inclusive. Because if we want a meritocracy, it's going to come from everyone doing their part. And this grassroots movement requires leadership. But the good news is that since we work in tech, we really should understand grassroots movements, especially if you've worked in open source software projects. Now, one of the first books on open source software was this one, called The Cathedral and the Bazaar by Eric S. Raymond. And in this book, Raymond describes the miracle of Linux. And most of us are not old enough to remember this, but Linux was this miracle, right? This kernel that a bunch of people were hacking against to create this operating system, and it worked. So Raymond began to use the principles of open source software development in his projects, and he distilled the lessons that he learned in this book. Raymond likened closed source software to the cathedral, right, with centralized kind of top-down management, and he compared it to the open source model, which was like this loud, babbling bazaar where power is equally distributed and there are lots of loud voices. And Raymond found that the bazaar model actually produced better results than the cathedral model. Now, the lesson that's most remembered from the book is this one. Given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. And some of you may have heard this from the book. But there's a more defined version, a more formal version in the book which says this. Given a large enough beta tester and co-developer base, almost every problem will be characterized quickly and the fix obvious to someone. Now, I'm sure Eric S. Raymond would disagree with me, if you know Eric S. Raymond, but that's a statement of inclusion. Raymond linked the size of the co-developer base to problem solving. And what else is innovation but the ability to solve problems? And I really believe that if we let software development be this big, babbling, boisterous bazaar that Raymond described, then, and if we let people into this bazaar who are dedicated to making things better, I really believe that there's no problem we won't be able to solve. And that nearly unlimited ability to solve problems is made possible by inclusion. But the sad reality is that just like our repositories are protected by passwords and permissions, often our communities and our corporations are protected by privilege. And there are voices that we keep out of the bazaar. And there are certain groups that have a hard time lending their voices to this bazaar because they lack privilege. And this is really a tragedy because, whatever problems you have in your company or in your source code, or however you ship software to customers, there's someone out there who can solve those problems. But all too often, we deny entry to these people. We deny entry to our teams. We deny entry to our open source projects. We deny entry to even our communities. And this really has business destructive value because one core competency that every corporation has to have is the ability to recruit and retain talent. And there are some who may disagree, but talent comes in all shapes, sizes, races, genders, level of physical ability, sexual preferences, and a whole host of other characteristics. So if your company even partially excludes any group, then you are severely handicapping your ability to bring talent into your company. Now, to understand how this works and how we, as software developers, can make things better, we have to understand privilege. But before we do that, it's really important that we understand what privilege is not. Having privilege does not mean that life is easy for you or that you haven't worked hard. It doesn't mean you haven't sacrificed, nor does it mean that you aren't good at what you do. Privilege is like riding a bicycle up a hill. You're working hard, the sun's hot, you're sweating, you might have a little muscle spasm going on, so you're really hard trying to get to the top of that hill. However, there are some people who don't have your privilege, and for them, getting up that hill is a lot harder. Their journey is much more difficult. There are things that you don't have to, that they have to deal with that you don't even know about. But having privilege does not remove the responsibility from you of understanding that some people don't share your privilege and that their journey through technology is harder than yours. Now, I'm a member of an underrepresented group in tech. I'm a black person, if you haven't noticed. But I do have gender privilege. And working in tech as a male brings a whole host of benefits that I take for granted. One of those benefits is being given the benefit of the doubt when I talk about what I do. Simply being a man and talking about working in software, I don't get a lot of pushback when I do that. But people who lack gender privilege often have different obstacles. So, when I first came to Budapest, I like to just walk around at nighttime and see the city, and the Parliament building, I think is really beautiful at night when it's lit up. And so I really like looking at the nighttime view of cities. Now, I'm a 6'2" black guy, work out a little bit. I'm not going to be too worried about walking around Budapest at night. But if I didn't have my male privilege, if I was a woman, I probably would have been a little bit more concerned. And my sense of danger would have been heightened. But gender privilege also has even more severe implications inside corporate walls. Women in tech often have to constantly manage two roles. They have to fill the role they were hired to fill, while also fighting the stereotypical role that others impose on them. And it's this secondary role, the role of fighting unwanted stereotypes and biases, that often makes it so exhausting to be a woman in tech. And that's why I believe that those of us with gender privilege should lend privilege to women in tech so that they can simply do their jobs, simply do what they were hired to do. So now that we know what privilege is not, let's define privilege. Privilege is simply access to benefits based on traits that you possess. Those benefits could be schools, they could be jobs, they could be social circles, getting access to them, leadership roles, or wealth. And I define two major categories of privilege. The most well-known category, and this is the access that I'm talking about, but the most well-known category of privilege is birth privilege. And these are things like your parental, your racial, your assigned gender, and your physical privilege. You're born with these privileges based on whoever made you had in their DNA. And so whatever traits your parents had, those were baked into your birth privilege. And it's really ironic that it's these privileges that are the root of most biases, even though we don't control them, we don't choose them. Now, the second category of privilege are what I call selected privilege, or selected traits. And those are things like religion, or maybe where you went to school, or your marital status. And these often change as we grow and develop. Now, it's human nature to share privilege with people like us. And there's just something in human nature that compels us to help those who remind us of who we are. We just like people who are like us. So those of us with gender privilege usually share our benefits with people who also have gender privilege. And if you have racial privilege, you share those benefits with people who have racial privilege. But I think it's far more powerful to lend your privilege to those who lack your privilege. Now, the combination of your birth privilege and your selected privilege is what combines to become what I call your portfolio privilege. Now, this portfolio creates a set of benefits that often make it easier to work in tech. Now, I want everyone to look up here and choose at least one privilege that you think you have, right? Some of you may have all of these. Some of you may have only one or two. So just think about at least one and just kind of fix that in your mind. I'll give you a couple seconds to do that, all right? You got one? Now think about your privilege and think about how your career in technology would be different if you started out without that privilege. What if you started your career without your gender privilege or your racial privilege, without the privilege of going to Stanford or MIT, or if you didn't even have the privilege of being able to walk around or even see? How much harder would your journey through software development be without these privileges? Now think about the people in tech some of whom you work with every day who are less privileged than you, and they have to navigate their careers at a serious disadvantage, simply because they lack your privileges. Now, I believe that you, everyone in here, can help remove those disadvantages by lending your privilege. By spreading the benefits that you gain from your portfolio privilege, you increase the value of everyone. Think of it as privilege diversification. Most of us have some kind of finance training, and you understand that in your 401k or if you have a stock portfolio, having a diverse portfolio makes your portfolio more valuable. And it's the same way with your privilege, that by lending privilege, you really increase the empowerment felt by everyone. Now, I want to illustrate 3 types of privilege lending through these 3 women. And these are real women, but I'm going to give them made-up names. Let's call them B, L, and M. Now, those are made-up names, but I'm sure they're very similar to people that you work with every day at work. And so for each type of privilege, I'm going to describe what it is, give an example, and then show how this plays out in software development. All right? So the first type of privilege lending is what I call credibility lending. And that's providing visibility for someone without privilege. For example, LGBTQ people often feel restricted in tech because we have a heteronormative industry. We're all a bunch of cisgendered people usually, and we think that that's norm, right? That the norm is heterosexual. And because of that, often our LGBTQ colleagues don't feel like they have a place in tech. And so how can you lend privilege to people from that group? Well, here's an example. Several months ago, Stephen Colbert invited DeRay McKesson, who's a pretty well-known activist, to his show. And Colbert let DeRay sit in his chair. And you see this in this picture. And by doing that, Colbert demonstrated credibility lending. DeRay gained the powerful platform of Colbert's chair, which raised his profile, because that's how credibility lending works. So how can this work at your workplace? Let's say you work with B, and she is the one who was instrumental in developing that killer feature in your last release. And you know, she's a great teammate. She's always active in your team Slack. She always helps team members who join our new team members who have joined your company. And she has a great institutional memory of why we built the architecture the way that we did. She knows where all the skeletons in the closet are positioned. But most of the senior leaders in your company don't even know her name, right? They think sometimes that she might be security or work at the front desk. So how can you help B? Well, you can lend her credibility by, at the next board meeting that you get invited to, why not bring her along and let her present that feature that she developed and raise her profile in your company, right? There's just one simple way to lend privilege. Now, the next type of privilege lending is what I call access lending. Now, access lending is providing entry for someone without privilege. And I've been very fortunate to work with a lot of amazing women in tech. But the sad thing is that women in tech experience sexism because they lack gender privilege. And this often causes women to lack their own abilities, despite the tremendous value that women bring to every tech company I've ever walked into that had a strong set of women developers or managers or leaders. And I think that access lending can be a powerful technique to fix this. So here's the example. Tracy Chow is a very well-known activist. You may have heard of her name, and she's really put in a lot of good work to help make our industry more inclusive. Well, Tracy Chow shared the story of how when she was a student at Stanford taking her CS classes, she was kind of struggling. And she heard the male students say, oh, that test was so easy, and that lab, it was a breeze. And so she began to think, oh my God, everyone else is just breezing through and I'm struggling. Well, one of her professors approached Tracy and said, well, I want you to be a TA. And she says, me, be a TA? And she resisted, but he eventually won her over, and Tracy Chow became a TA, and that gave her access to the grades. And she saw that those male students really weren't doing much better than she was. And that allowed her to reevaluate her place in tech, and she thought that, okay, I have a place in tech. So how can this work at your company? Let's consider Elle, who spent the last month implementing your container strategy. She's super smart. She can always answer your questions, and she's always available to help solve problems. So why not lend her access by letting her go to that Docker conference that always wants you to speak, because you're a hot technology speaker. You speak at events, but you don't even do Docker. You can't even spell Docker. Why not let Tracy go and let her realize that she too has a place at tech events? Now, the final category, the final example of lending privilege that I want to share with you is what I call expertise lending. And that's providing a voice to someone without privilege. People of color in tech, we often feel that we don't have a voice in tech companies because we're not the faces you see on magazine covers or people who are invited to be guests on podcasts. And so often we feel that because we don't lack the racial privilege that a lot of leaders in tech have, that we can't really be leaders. And I think that expertise lending can fix this. So here's the example. Former First Lady Michelle Obama spoke at South by Southwest a couple years ago, and she gave a really great example of expertise lending during her keynote. And she said, if you've got a voice at the table, ask, is there diversity around the table? Are there voices and opinions that don't sound like yours? That's expertise lending. That's the kind of mindset that you really need to have. So you can practice this type of privilege lending by giving M, who's really one of your best developers, the opportunity to be a lead on your next project. After all, she's made it her mission to convert your product's front end to Angular. And by letting her lead, you give her a chance to lend her voice to your company. So those are three types of privilege lending, and it's really surprisingly easy to do. And I hope that you've thought about other types of privilege that you can lend in tech. But I want to caution you that lending privilege is not a silver bullet. It's not something that you try once or twice, and if it doesn't work, you're like, okay, that doesn't work, I'm done. Lending privilege has to become a philosophy of your life. You really have to buy into it. You have to believe in the bizarre described by Eric S. Raymond, and that there are benefits to having truly inclusive teams in software development. Now, last year, I gave this talk at a conference where Common, who's a rapper, everyone heard of Common? Okay, I don't know if that was my black privilege that lets me know who Common is, but I like Common a lot. And Common is known for a number of hit songs. He gave a great concert at this tech conference, but one of my favorite Common songs is from a movie called Selma that he wrote with John Legend. And the song is called Glory. And the chorus from that song goes like this: one day, when the glory comes, it will be ours. It will be ours. And this song really captures the essence of why I think diversity and inclusion is so important. When we have a diverse and inclusive technology industry, it won't mean that women win or that gay people win or transgender people win or black people win. It really means that we all win. And I'm from America, and America's had a somewhat uneven journey through equality. But at every stage that my country has fought to advance the rights of the disenfranchised, we've seen this happen. During the last political, you may have heard of our last election, was kind of weird. But during the election, a really brave Muslim American father at a convention offered one of the candidates a copy of the Constitution. And a group called the ACLU let anyone who wrote and asked, if you want a copy, we'll send you one. And so, I hadn't read the Constitution since maybe I was in high school. And so I applied and I got a copy, and I have it in my bag. And so I was reading through the Constitution, and I was like, you know what? This is a pretty cool document. It's really well structured, and it holds up pretty well. And then I looked a little further, and I realized that the founders built a pull request system into the Constitution. And so you can make changes to the document. We call them amendments, and those changes can be requested, reviewed, and then merged back in. Now, it's a very unpleasant review process. It's only happened about 27 times in a couple centuries, but it works pretty well. And I think just like in software, the source code in the master branch is usually pretty cool, but there's a lot of meat in the pull request. And so when I was looking at the amendments to the Constitution, I saw a certain pattern. And a lot of people learn in college or maybe in high school that the 13th Amendment was the one that abolished slavery. And a lot of people think that it made it illegal to own black slaves, but that's not how it reads. The 13th Amendment made it illegal to own anyone. And so as a descendant of black slaves, I'm sure that my ancestors rejoiced at the 13th Amendment, but really all Americans won because they now lived in a country where everyone was truly free. And when the 17th Amendment gave women the right to vote, I'm sure half the population of the country celebrated by being let into the franchise, but really all Americans won because they lived in a country where gender was no longer held against them at the ballot box. And so stepping away from the amendments, when the Supreme Court a few years ago declared that same-sex marriage is just marriage and therefore protected, I'm sure that a lot of gay and lesbian couples rejoiced, but really we all won because that meant we now lived in a country that put no restrictions on who you could love. As a nation, my country has tried to form a more perfect union by addressing the wrongs done to people of color, women, and LGBTQ people, and I think we can form a more perfect software industry by addressing our own peculiar problems. When we take the lead in making software development a place where everyone is welcome, no matter who you are, what you look like, who you love, then we all win because we will then work in an industry that puts no limits on talent. One day, when the glory comes, it will be ours. It will be ours. Now, most of us work in tech, and we really want to leave our mark on tech. We want to put our mark on pull requests and commits and lines of code and write that next library that everyone uses. But I think if we truly want to make our mark in software, then lending privilege is a powerful way to do it. Because long after the code we write is decommissioned and the people we work with move on to other teams, the privilege we share can bring lasting change to our industry. Now, I know that some of you may be unconvinced that diversity and inclusion are things that you should even think about. You maybe say, Anjuan, I'm just a developer, I'm just a guy, I'm a code monkey, I like just writing my code, checking it in, going home. And I get it. I get that sentiment. You may think that diversity and inclusion has nothing to do with building software or even being a tech lead. But while I don't have any proof, I'm sure that if Leonard Nimoy, when he walked into the office of Paramount, was asked by the studio executives, hey, we're just making a sci-fi TV show. What does paying a black woman have to do with that? And I hope that if he was posed that question, that he will respond that it had everything to do with making a sci-fi TV show. Because I have to believe that the man who played the character that symbolized the power of infinite diversity and infinite combinations, I believe that he had to believe that there's power in creating an environment where everyone is equally rewarded for bringing their ideas, their talents, their perspectives, and their passions to making software. So if we want women, people of color, LGBTQ people, and other marginalized groups, and there are many other groups, but we want them to come into technology, stay, and get promoted, if we want that boisterous bazaar where no bug is deep, then we all have a role to play by lending our privilege. Thank you. So, thank you so much. We have questions, and so while I'm going through the questions, I'm going to read them out, and you can upvote ones that if you see one that you want to ask, then it'll go to the top. So, number one is from MK, and he asks, how can we ask for a privileged loan without being forward aggressive if no one in our company is lending? And it's interesting. There was an article that came out a few months ago saying that just by speaking about diversity and inclusion, you often become a target. There are certain people in technology who don't like to talk about the problems, especially the social and cultural ones. So there is danger, and I'll be honest, in doing this work. I know there are some people who may see my talks and like, I don't want that guy to work at my company. And I've been very fortunate to have a really good career in tech. But this question is really more from the perspective of, hey, I need help. I need you to lend me your privilege. And I do think that that can be a very tough ask. But kind of flipping the question around, I found that the best way to understand how to lend your privilege is to just become aware. To just be aware that, yeah, this person may have a different skin color than me, or a different gender, or maybe they're in a wheelchair, but at the end of the day, they just want to do good work. They want to be paid a fair wage for what they do. They want to help contribute to their personal lives. And if you understand that, then you'll see these really artificial barriers come down. So I always encourage people who have privilege to lend to do that, to just become more aware of the people around you, and over time, gradually look for ways to help them. Because I think you'll see that really they're just like you, and the same help that you probably received is the same help that you can give to them. And so if you're someone who's asking for privilege, I think just live your truth. Just be who you are. Don't hide your experience. I think that sharing your lived experiences is really powerful. And I know it's hard, but I hope that you found someone at your company or maybe in your community who seems sensitive to this type of work, to diversity and inclusion. You can take the initiative and say, not that I need your privilege, but I want you to know who I am, right? That's a very human need. We all have a need to be understood, and I think we often enjoy understanding other people. So share your lived experiences, and I think that over time, you'll find someone who is willing to lend their privilege to you. The next question is, how can we as individuals raise awareness about lending privilege in our companies? And I think that there are a lot of really small steps that you can take. So one, most of you work at companies that I'm sure hire people, right? Or you wouldn't work there. And if you have any influence under job postings, then you could say, you know what, I went to a conference and we like hiring people, right? That's really an important thing. And I learned that there's really a really effective way to write our job descriptions in a way that don't alienate people. And you could say, you know what, I'll help write job descriptions for the next, let's say, quarter. And by doing that, you can help to change your hiring practices to align more with a more inclusive culture. So to explain that, there's a few studies that show that how men look at a job description and how women look at it are really different. So to really simplify how this works, a man in general will see a list of requirements for a job and say, I have no idea what that is. I don't even know what that is. I haven't even heard of that. Oh, but I can do that. I'm going to apply. A woman will often look at a job description and say, I've done that for 10 years. I wrote the book on that. I get a training class last week on that. Oh, I don't know that. I'm not qualified. You see the difference in how that works? And so there are ways that you can write your job descriptions to really reduce that effect, and there are lots of articles on that. And so you can become educated in that and begin to change how people even know about your company, because often the first time we learn about a company is by looking for a job, right? So that's one way. So I think look at how you already have influence and begin to make a change in your span of control. Let's say you are responsible for building the website for your company. Most company websites aren't very inclusive. You see normally a lot of white males on the website, very few women, though that's getting better, but often not a lot of people of color. Well, why not say, hey, I want to revamp our website, and I think we should have a more inclusive representation of people on our website, right? Our website is our business card to the entire world. So why don't I find some stock photography, or maybe I'll help shoot some photos, and let's become more inclusive. So I think that that's one way that inside your company, there are things that you probably control right now that will help your company become more inclusive and more opening. One common technique is that when you get resumes, that you remove the name and any information that may help you identify the race or gender of the person who's applying. And often companies find that people pass through the funnel to the interview more when you remove this, because just to be honest, if your name is Jamal and your resume is to someone named Jimmy, Jamal's often put to the side just because there are just implicit biases that we have. Or if your name is Kelly and you're next to Ken, there's normally a greater weight placed on Ken because of biases. So what I would say is to start with what you can control right now and look for ways to say, is there something in my span of control that is keeping people from coming to my company? All right, I feel, this is anonymous. Hello, anonymous. I feel it's important to lend privilege outside of our individual companies as well to increase the breadth of the community. Do you have suggestions to this? Yes. One, I do have suggestions, and I totally agree that lending privilege is not simply something that is just in tech. I think that in many ways, when we're dealing with diversity and inclusion the way that often women and LGBTQ people and people of color often feel not welcome, we're really dealing with societal problems. We're dealing with almost a congenital disease that is just baked into, and in America, I think, as an American, I tend to think that we have a longer journey, but we're trying to often just treat the symptoms, right? We probably can't cure the disease, but can we manage the symptoms? And I think that there's a lot of things that you can do in your community. I think one thing that you can do is go to other communities, right? So you probably live somewhere, and you may live in a community that is homogenous in some way. Go down the road and go to a community that's different. And I often tell people, don't just start something, because most people in the community, when you come in, you say, I'm doing a code after school program where I want to help black kids learn how to code. That's a cool idea, but do you really understand these people? Are you just trying to feel good about yourself by doing this? So just by spending time around people who are not like you in your community and just understanding, right? Most communities have outside events where they'll have, we're meeting at the park, we're all going to have a night out at the park, and kids can come and they'll have little bounce houses. Just go, just show up. And by spending time becoming more aware and becoming more known in that community, it'll become more clear how you can help. And then you'll begin to know people's names and their individual stories. You can say, you know what, I heard that you got laid off last week, and actually, I'm happy to write a letter of recommendation for you because I've gotten to know you and I think you're a really good person. And by doing that, you can lend your privilege to people outside of your community, but you have to invest time in knowing that community. You can't be a stranger trying to help people. You really have to know them. And again, I think at the end of the day, you're going to find out these people are just like you. They have the same hopes. They have the same dreams. They just may not have access to things that you have access to. All right? The next question, anonymous again. All right. Could you tell us the most memorable situation when somebody lent you his privilege? And I would say that this is probably more of a lent me her privilege. Actually, the company I'm working with right now, we have a woman who's an amazing president, and she's building a great company. And I went through the interview process, and I think I was a pretty good fit, but I let that candidate that came through, there's this recruiter who was involved, and this recruiter actually kind of had not a very good reputation after a while, but she didn't hold that against me. And I think that she saw what I brought to the company, she saw my story, and she lent me the privilege of being the president of a company, and she let me work there. And we've worked together on a lot of initiatives, and I've been really happy. One, to say that the top of my company is a woman, and two, to say that she's also an amazing leader. And we're a small company. It's called Questback. And I've worked for Accenture, Deloitte. I work for big companies led by powerful men, but the woman at my company can run circles around all of them. And I'm happy to work for her company. So yeah, that's a memorable recent situation where someone let me by privilege. But all throughout my career, people have taken a chance on me. People where I've been the first black person hired in that company. And so I really have benefited from being lent a lot of privilege in my career. And one reason why I do this talk is giving back. All right, I got 50 seconds for one last question. How special discounts and conferences lead to lending privilege? I'm not sure what this question is, so I'm going to skip to the next one. Can you persuade somebody to lend his privilege? I don't think you can. I think that you have to present the case, and I think that you have to give the benefits, and I think that you have to just speak your truth. And hopefully you'll find people who will join this battle. There's an idea of being an ally. I don't think we need allies. Underrepresented groups need co-conspirators. Join us in helping make the society better, and you will also benefit. All right? That's my time. Thank you. All right.